Yeah, this one's got chocolate malts in it, and that's what I wanted to kind of get to is how do you make a malt taste like chocolate?
so so uh, so you have to take into account that we're still talking about a piece of grain that we're roasting, right? So there's no vanilla, there's not really sugar. I mean, there's obviously some malt sweetness that comes from the malt, but it's not like eating chocolate, right? There's no cocoa butter, there's none of that.
Yeah.
So the chocolate flavor refers to a dark, rich sort of chocolate. I mean, you have this sort of slightly bitter but nice dark character, which is sort of the dark chocolate. And so how we do it is we take finished malt and throw that in the roaster, and it takes about 90 minutes to an hour to 2 hours to bring up the temperature of this roaster, right? So the drum is continuously turning as we heat this up, and in that process, you slowly brown and darken the entire kernel. That's why it takes so long. Right, a normal coffee batch takes 14 to 17, 18 minutes for these beans to roast, but for grains it's a lot longer because you have to give it more time. Otherwise, the outside burns and the inside is untouched, kind of thing. So you have to be a little bit more gentle. And and we just take it up to about 230 Celsius, so 460 or so, right? Pretty warm. And then pull it out, cool it down fairly quickly on a cooling table, and that's what chocolate malt is. And so the biscuit, right, the lightest version, so the same starting point, we throw in regular malt and just toast it for 40 minutes. You end up with that, and so then everything in between, and it's all about density. So the darkest that we make is a raw barley roasted, called roasted barley. So if you want like a stout, a pitch black stout, you have to use something like that. And because the raw grain, right, we haven't malted it, so the kernel is rock solid still. Whereas if you use malt, right, doing this modification that I talked about earlier, the kernel is broken up and friable, right? That's why it melts so nicely. And so there's all these air pockets in it. So heat doesn't travel as well. It's like a little insulator, right? So it takes time for it to heat up. If you use raw grain, we can go much harder with temperature and heat exposure and make it even darker. And so that's sort of the sort of the trick on roasting. And so that's always dry malt. And then the other thing you can do, which makes all these crystal malts, some say caramel malt, but it's really crystal malts, is when you take green malt out of the germination box before you kiln it. So before it's dry, it's super active, right? All the enzymes are active, the kernel is well modified, and if you take that out and put it in a roaster, you're literally mini mashing the kernels in that heat, right? And so you it's like a million little brew kettles, these kernels. And after about an hour or so of sort of stewing these in their own hot juice with the enzymes further breaking down these starches, you have this sugar juice kernel, and you turn on the dry heat and dry down in the roaster, and you make, crystal 10, crystal 20, crystal 60, crystal 80, these very, very, sweet toffee-ish malts that create the sweet backbone of any rich beer, because those sugars don't ferment. So all the fermentable sugars I've made during malting are basically fuse back together in this caramel or crystallizing process. And so crystal malts are also specialty malts made in a roaster and are primarily for residual body that doesn't ferment away, essentially, in the beer.
Wow.
So if you're
That's
not using syrup, right, but you use malt, you can use all these ingredients to kind of fine tune, how much back sweetness you have, what color you have, right? So that's why people switch to all grain brewing, right?
Yeah. I'd love to I'm sure I've had some beers. I'm sure Reese has definitely had some beers that have that crystallized malt. But now I'm going to seek them out intentionally.
So
because that sounds amazing.
A lot of IPAs use it, right? They use Pilsner, and then they put in 5% of there's various names, but a crystal 20 or crystal 40 to give it a little bit more of a color, but also then this sort of sweet backbone against the alcohol and the hop bitterness.
Right.
It's very common. So the crystals show up quite a bit, even though you don't know it, in a lot of beers to kind of balance body with bitterness.
Right.
I'm a bit curious. Go ahead, AJ.
I was gonna say that's the thing I've researched, in some of this stuff, trying to learn more about it, is the balancing act of brewing is like a science in itself, where you've got, a beer that if you're trying to hit a certain alcohol content, well, then you need to use a certain amount of malts. And then if you don't want it to taste too biscuity or too sweet, you've got to add more hops. But if you add too much hops, there's got to be more of this, there's just so much that goes into it. It's such a complex process, even though it's so simple in terms of like high level number of ingredients. It's pretty simple, but just to get things just perfect, everything from temperature to sanitization to cooling, all that stuff plays into how it tastes in the end, it's just fascinating.